Every single Honeycrisp apple on Earth is genetically identical, not similar. Identical down to the DNA, to one tree that first fruited in a Minnesota research orchard decades ago. If you planted the seeds from that exact apple, the resulting tree would produce fruit so different, so unpredictable, it almost certainly would not taste anything like a Honeycrisp at all. This is the story of how humans turned one of the most genetically diverse fruits on the planet into an army of clones, and how that fruit came within a hair of vanishing entirely before a forest in Kazakhstan saved it. Here's the fact that sounds impossible until you understand apple biology. Apple trees do not grow true from seed. Plant the seeds from even the most perfect apple you have ever eaten, and the resulting tree will produce something genetically unique, because apples reproduce through extreme heterozygosity, meaning each seed inside a single apple carries a wildly different genetic combination from its siblings.
Everything seems to be in order.
Plant 10 seeds from one apple, and you could get 10 trees producing 10 completely different fruits, ranging from delicious to genuinely inedible. This fact explains something that sounds like folklore, but is entirely true. Johnny Appleseed, the real historical figure behind the legend, whose actual name was John Chapman, spent decades in the early 1800s planting orchards from seed, exactly as the stories describe. But the popular image of him spreading delicious eating apples across the frontier is almost entirely wrong. Because apples do not grow true from seed, the vast majority of trees Chapman planted produced fruit that was small, bitter, and essentially inedible raw. Chapman was running a savvy business. Under a legal framework that granted land claims to settlers who planted orchards as proof of intended settlement, Chapman established nurseries ahead of the wave of westward migration and sold the resulting trees, primarily for hard cider. In an era with limited access to clean drinking water, fermented cider was safer and more reliable than much of the available water supply, and it was mildly alcoholic besides. The sour, bitter apples that seed-grown trees reliably produced were actually ideal for cider, where tannins and acidity matter more than sweetness. Johnny Appleseed was not spreading Eden across America. He was planting the raw material for an alcoholic beverage industry, one tree at a time, and collecting free land for doing it. So how does anyone get a consistent apple variety at all, let alone grow millions of identical Honeycrisps or Galas worldwide? The answer is cloning through grafting. When growers find a single tree producing genuinely excellent fruit, they do not replant its seeds and hope for the best. They cut a small branch, called a scion, from that tree and physically attach it to the rootstock of a different, hardier tree. Every apple that scion ever produces is genetically identical to the original parent, because it is, in every meaningful genetic sense, the exact same organism, transplanted onto new roots rather than reproduced through seed. That means every Honeycrisp tree on Earth traces back through an unbroken chain of grafted cuttings to a single original tree released commercially in 1991. The same is true of Gala, first bred in New Zealand in the 1930s, of Fuji, developed in Japan and released in 1962, and of Red Delicious, first discovered as a chance seedling on an Iowa farm in 1880. Every commercially available apple variety you have ever purchased is a clone, propagated for generations from one ancestor tree. That reliance on cloning instead of genetic diversity created a serious, largely invisible vulnerability, and understanding it requires going back to the apple's actual biological origin, which turns out to be almost as surprising as the cloning itself. For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed the domesticated apple descended from a scattered mix of wild species with no single point of origin. Genetic research in the early
We need to check the
2000s,
tags on row
led by
16.
researchers including
Everything
Gary
seems to be in
Juniper at
order here.
Oxford, traced the primary ancestor of virtually every domesticated apple on Earth to one wild species, Malus sieversii, native specifically to the Tian Shan mountain forests.
This graft union looks very strong. We are seeing excellent tissue integration.
Extraordinary natural diversity, some producing fruit genuinely comparable in size and sweetness to modern varieties. That wild apple's journey from a remote Central Asian forest to becoming the ancestor of nearly every apple on Earth ran through the Silk Road. Wild apples along the trade routes were an obvious snack for travelers and pack animals over roughly 2,000 years of continuous trade, and seeds spread westward and eastward, occasionally crossbreeding with other wild species, and generating the genetic diversity early orchardists would eventually select from. Here is where the story turns genuinely alarming. The wild apple forests of Kazakhstan, the entire ancestral genetic reservoir behind every apple humans grow and eat, have been disappearing at an accelerating rate. Deforestation, disease, unregulated grazing, and inadequate conservation have already destroyed a significant portion of these forests, and researchers have warned that continued destruction could eliminate the wild ancestor species from its native habitat within decades. If that happens, an irreplaceable pool of genetic diversity that modern breeders still rely on for disease resistance would be gone permanently. That narrow genetic base is exactly why cloned apple crops are so vulnerable in the first place, and it has already caused real damage. Because every tree of a given variety is genetically identical, a disease that successfully attacks that specific genetic profile can devastate every orchard, growing it everywhere, simultaneously, since there is no natural variation to provide resistance. The Red Delicious offers a striking case. Growers spent decades chasing deep red color and shelf life, propagating increasingly bland, mealy strains of the same clone until consumer demand collapsed and Red Delicious lost its decades-long position as America's top-selling apple within the past 15 years, with no genetic diversity available to correct course. In response, the USDA and international botanical institutions have established gene bank orchards, specifically to preserve wild and heirloom apple diversity, including active efforts to collect specimens directly from Kazakhstan's remaining forests before further habitat loss makes that genetic material permanently unavailable. And modern breeders increasingly draw on these preserved resources to reintroduce disease resistance into new varieties. What began as a wildly diverse forest of genetically unpredictable trees in the mountains of Central Asia became, through 2,000 years of Silk Road migration and centuries of human grafting, an entire global industry built on a handful of endlessly cloned genetic copies. Every bite of a Honeycrisp or Gala connects you, through an unbroken chain of grafted tissue, to a single original tree, while the wild diversity that made that discovery possible quietly disappears from the forests where it still exists. If this story surprised you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Drop a comment and tell us what everyday food you want us to dig into next.